Well, hello, good evening. It's about 5:30 p.m. Central Mountain Time, October 21st, 2020. That's what I'm calling the Back to the Future Part 2 Day. Because, that's the day Marty McFly and Dr. Emmett Brown, along with Marty's girlfriend Jennifer, went to the future, which is now in the past, on October 21st, 2015. And the movie Back to the Future. I know a lot of kids like myself who like these movies and used to watch them. And, there was a interview that was given while they was making this movie that hoverboards were actually had actually been invented, but a lot of parental groups and consumer advocacy groups had kept them off the market. This was obviously a joke that was told by one of the producers. There is no such thing as hoverboards in the late 80s. There is no such thing as hoverboards now, at least. uh, not on the market that for mass production. And see pardon me, the sun's coming in. Let me move a little bit here so it doesn't distract you. But uh, one thing I think interesting about the future that was actually in uh, Back to the Future Part 2, it is actually a dystopia. If you look at it, we're only really giving shown one afternoon, evening, uh, pretty much about this same time of day, uh, about what things are going on in the future. There is obviously Marty has been sent to the future to stop his son Marty Jr. from committing a criminal crime, and his daughter from you know, going to jail too, and there is no such thing as lawyers in 2015, which means there is no judicial system that we know of. There's no such thing as due process. There's no thing as right to attorney, and you're pretty much living in almost like a society out of Judge Dredd, where you can commit a crime and immediately be sentenced. And what kind of future is that to live in? I know there's not to get political, but I know there's some questions now about how the Republicans have been packing the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but a lot of other courts along the way, farther down. Uh, and you got to ask yourself, who wants to live in that world? And another thing people don't realize is there is high inflation in that movie. I know this is a running gag. I kind of wish they'd quit doing all these movies set in the future because it really it's a trope that I wish they'd just do away with. I don't think they're being creative. I think they're kind of rubbing it in our faces that we ought to be glad that we're paying this much now for this because in 10, 15 years it's going to cost more. And I know when I started driving in 1994, uh, people would freak out if gas was uh, a buck 05. I mean, that just pissed people off. Now, gas is just barely unleaded under $2, and people are just crossing their fingers. It doesn't go over $2, and but yeah, there's a lot of high inflation in that movie, and there's also the thing about the thumbs. You can calm down now. Daddy's doing a video. Cat. You can everything's by your thumb, which I think is interesting because there's no cash, and people can just press their thumb on something, and it's kind of like you're in a network, which I don't think a lot of people would agree to nowadays. This is kind of like something out of the movie. What was it, In Time, with Justin Timberlake and the Killian Murphy, where They have the things on their wrist where uh, it has their how much time they have. I think it's, but that's kind of a freaky concept. But I kind of wish they'd quit doing that because it's not an interesting trope, especially when it's only like 25, 30 years in the future, which it was at that time. And I think it's kind of it's funny when you go back and you look at things at 1985, which would seem relatively similar to what we have nowadays. I think it's kind of funny that the future is this whacked out uh, authoritarian society, which brings me to my next thing I want to touch on is that scene in which this if you were born and grew up during the 80s, there was this hysteria, and it continued on to the 90s. You don't hear much about it anymore, but there was this hysteria in the 80s that the Japanese uh, industrial business world was going to take over all of America. It was in a lot of uh, movies. RoboCop 3, I think, was one of them. And it was that the central plot of Rising Sun, which came out in the early 90s. But this was obviously anger toward the automobile industry in the 70s and 80s. And that really had more to do with American uh, businesses screwing over workers than it did with Japanese business people. You know, only thing I think it's kind of funny that one of the Sony is one of the biggest uh, film production companies nowadays, and so uh, they didn't get that one right. But there's a scene in which Marty, 47 years old, is talking with a coworker, Needles, played by the rock musician Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers, and about some type of scheme. We never knew. We never know what they're doing. That's what's so interesting about this movie is that what they're doing, what Marty Jr. is going to do with Grip Tannen, and what Marty Sr. is doing with Needles, we never do know. So he does this scheme. He doesn't like being called chicken, even though this wasn't in the first movie. You think that would have been addressed, but his boss is monitoring his phone calls, his private phone calls. I mean, you hear stories this day about people who post stuff on the internet and they get in trouble for it, but they're posting it on a public forum. This is like somebody literally running through a mall and screaming, crazy stuff, running through a mall naked, or putting on a billboard, I hate so and so, and for people, or I hate women, or it's. But this is somebody who's having a private conversation with another person on what is supposed to be a private line, which means that there is your bosses can monitor your telephone calls, your phone calls, which I think it scares people because there's been so much uh, issues come out, especially with social media, over the last 10 years about whether or not uh, your employer can have access to your social media accounts. Can they view them? You should make whether or not you can keep them private. Or I've even heard some people actually say that uh, they've actually had their bosses even ask for their passwords for their Facebook or Instagram accounts And I think it really begs the question of, is that really a nice future that they're living in? Because to me, we're only seeing less than a day in the lives of one family in Hill Valley, California. And Hill Valley, California in 2015 could have been a nice place to stay. We see with the neighborhood of Hilldale isn't so pleasant. And but I was watching Slaughterhouse-Five, based on the Kurt Vonnegut novel with the same name, and he said 1940s mid, the last year of the World War II, the winter of 1945, there was a Allied firebombing of Dresden, Germany. Dresden at the time was like this European beautiful utopia, but even though they were Nazis, they had not been touched by the war until the Allies firebombed it. And that could have been the same thing with Hill Valley. Hill Valley is kind of like the nice little town in California where everyone lives, but LA or San Francisco or San Diego are hell zones. So, and that could have been the one of the ulterior motives for Doc Brown getting Marty to go to the future. There's been a long discussion that it's almost like Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow, in which Marty has died multiple times and Doc Brown is trying to save his life, and that would obviously explain snafu in the timeline, because Marty Sr. was injured in a car accident in which he was drag racing with needles, and he rammed into a Rolls Royce. But we don't find that out till after the third film, and the only way that would have happened if he had gone back to the Old West and gone through the whole mess and gotten Jennifer in his truck to take her on a trip, to see where the train has demolished the DeLorean, which makes you also wonder, how did Doc Brown know they were going to be at the train tracks at that exact same time? So there's been a lot of theories that this is actually an ongoing thing, that we're actually seeing Doc Brown's finally trying to make things right. Kind of like Groundhog Day or Edge of Tomorrow, where he keeps doing this over and over and over and over. There's a scene, like I said, Back to the Future Part 2, where a lot of people have said that when Marty is being chased underneath the tunnel by Biff, he drops the rope line down for Marty to swing on. Now, how could he have known that if Marty hadn't died? Oh my God! So the movie is actually pretty dark if you look at it. There's actually this dark dystopia. Maybe the man who was driving whoever was driving the Rolls Royce in 1985 Hill Valley led to a chain reaction, a butterfly effect, in which the world dives down into weird despair. And I know that they have kept some politics out of the whole Back to the Future trilogy, but they did say that the idea of Biff Tannen, being this big billionaire in the alternative 1985 was based on Donald Trump. And if you ever notice, there's something in the first film where the theater in 1985 is showing X-rated films, whereas in the 1955 it's showing a Ronald Reagan film. And we all knew how Reagan went after Hollywood. There's been a long story that Al Haig, who was Secretary of State, pretty much sent out a memo to a lot of Hollywood bigwigs saying things are going to change in Hollywood under Reagan. And so, it's not that great of a future if you have to deal with No judicial system, no due process, no uh, amendment rights, eavesdropping. You're basically, I mean, it looks nice 25 years out, but when you look at it, it's actually a pretty crazy future to live in, and it's almost kind of a good thing that, you know, they let Biff have the almanac, which doesn't make any sense. Why would Doc Brown knowingly leave it, you know, right side up in a open garbage can in the alleyway? Unless he knew somebody was going to take it. So, something, something to think about. Something. This is heavy.